It seemed that winter would never end. It snowed almost continuously every day. At the end of February, or maybe at the beginning of March, I don't remember exactly when, we were transported by rail to a town, the main supply centre. It was located 50 kilometers from Kharkov. In large sheds there were warehouses of food, tents, medicines and ammunition. Every cell, every free space was filled with them. Dock shops were partly in buildings, partly in the open air. Soldiers, whose fingers could no longer hold a wrench from the cold, blew on their hands. Trenches and fortifications were built outside the city. Guerrilla attacks were not uncommon in this part of the country. When an attack began, mechanics would drop their tools and grab their machine guns, protecting the equipment and themselves. The only good thing here is the food, one soldier told me. There's plenty of work. We have to defend ourselves. We take turns patrolling, and the partisans are no joke. They caused us a lot of trouble, destroyed a lot of things. Several times the commander asked me to send a company of infantry to help him, but they sent it only once. There was an SS company, but 6 days later they were sent to the 6th Army. And we've already got 40 dead. In the afternoon we attached to the four-wheeled carts we had taken from the Russians the skids. We made sledges. There were several real sledges, simple ones and even wagons, in which horses with jewellery were harnessed. They were all requisitioned from the locals. I remember when we set off, the procession reminded me of a Christmas procession, except we were carrying bullets and grenades. We headed northwest toward Voronezh. Everyone received special rations designed for the cold, new first aid kits and a 2-day supply of pre-prepared lunches. We drove along a road here and there covered with snow, which crossed the defence line that cut the steppe. A fat, hooded soldier, the only guard in the neighbourhood, waved at us as we passed. He seemed so vulnerable here, standing leaning on his pipe, his feet knee-deep in snow. After an hour's ride, the snow had gotten even heavier. Our leather boots, although they were excellent protection from moisture, were still not suited for snowy metre-long drifts. We tired quickly, sat down on wagons or sledges like cripples. When we ran side by side, I ran my fingers through the horse's mane, which resembled sheep's wool in length. But the horses were going too fast, which made us even more tired, and sweat poured off us in spite of the cold. From time to time someone at the head of the column would stop and watch the convoy, taking the opportunity to catch his breath on that pretext. They resumed their journey at the rear of the convoy. I never saw anyone go ahead of the column. Gales, a true friend, clung to his horse on the other side. Although he was bigger and stronger than I was, I could see that his strength was at its limit. Gales's face was almost completely hidden by his collar and hat, which was pulled down as far as possible. His reddened nose was bleeding like the others. We hardly spoke at all. I had learned silence like a true German, but even without words I knew that Gales was a true friend, that he had the same kind feelings for me as I had for him. From time to time we smiled encouragingly at each other, as if to say, "Don't give up. We'll get through this." At some ravine we stopped. Feeling that I couldn't stand it any longer, I sat down on the edge of the wagon. My legs were stiff, and despair was written all over my face. Gales threw himself into a snowdrift. Oh, my poor legs. All along the convoy soldiers were sitting or lying in the snow. "Are we going to spend the night here?" asked a young soldier sitting next to me. We looked at each other anxiously. "I don't care what the others do," said Gales, opening the kettle. "I'm not going to move. You're just sweating, so you're talking. Wait till you get cold. You'll have to move if you don't want to freeze to death." "Shit," said Giles, without lifting his head. "My leg hurts." I took out the kettle. The pre-prepared lunches we'd been given earlier had long since cooled and frozen in the metal pot. Now the contents resembled some sort of scum. All the soldiers made the same discovery. "Damn it," said Giles. "But can you throw it away?" "What do you think?" Somebody asked a question to a lieutenant who was looking at the contents of his pot. "Those bastards must have slipped us some rotten stuff. Or a week's worth of leftovers. Unbelievable. There's enough food in this town to feed a division. It's impossible to eat. It sticks in your teeth. We'll have to leave some of it behind." "No, we won't," growled the field sergeant addressing us. "It's a long way, and we don't have much food. Throw away the meat if you don't like it and eat the rest." Gales, who was never very fussy, put something that looked like a cutlet in his mouth. 2 seconds later, he spat into the snow. Ugh, that's disgusting. Those bastards must have boiled a Bolshevik. Despite the desperate situation, we laughed. Gales, who had long been anticipating dinner, seeing what had happened to the food, went into a frenzy. Given his size, such scenes always made an impression, shouting curses. He kicked the pot with all his might. It flew over the snowdrift and fell. There was silence, and someone laughed. "Do you feel better now?" asked a young soldier standing next to me. Gales turned but said nothing. Then he went to pick up the cauldron. I began to devour the mixture seasoned with rotten meat. Gales had completely collapsed. He gathered up the contents of the cauldron scattered on the snow. A few minutes later, cursing fate, the two of us devoured my rations. The field officers were assigning sentries. We faced the question, where to spend the night? Already stiff, we did not know where to put our sleeping bags. Some of us dug holes in the snow. Others made a sort of hut, using the straw meant for the horses. Others warmed themselves by the horses, which were forced to lie down. It was not the first time we had spent the night in the open air, but there was always at least some protection from the cold. The thought of having to sleep in the midst of a field terrified us. Here and there the situation was discussed. They suggested that we should go on until we came across a village, or at least a house. They said that if we stayed where we were, half of us would not live to see the morning. "It's at least 3 days to the village," said the field felon. "We should try to get a better place to sleep in such conditions. If only we could make a fire," me exclaimed one soldier. He gritted his teeth and spoke almost crying. Terrified at the prospect, we did what we could. We shifted the load on the sled so that there was enough room for both of us between the boxes of explosives. Although it was not at all safe to sleep under such conditions, we preferred death by explosion to death by rigor mortis. We spent 2 weeks in such conditions. For many, those 2 weeks proved fatal. On the 3rd day, 2 contracted pneumonia. In the following days, frostbite appeared. First, the exposed parts of the face were affected, and then the rest of the body, even if it was wrapped. They saved themselves by covering their faces with a thick layer of yellow cream, making their appearance ridiculous and pathetic. 2 soldiers, mad with despair, ran away from the company and got lost in the vast snowy expanse. Another, very young, called for his mother and cried for hours. We both comforted and cursed him because the unfortunate one kept us awake. Toward morning, after he had been quiet for a while, we were awakened by the sound of a gunshot. We found him a little way off. He had tried to put an end to the nightmare, but had miscalculated and suffered until noon. My legs, which had been subjected to the horrible torture of continuous walking and incessant frost, were terribly sore at first, but soon I almost stopped feeling them. Later, when we were examined by a doctor, I found that 3 toes on my foot had turned an ashy grey colour. The nails had adhered to a double pair of smelly socks, which I took off for examination. As a result of a painful injection, my toes were saved from amputation. I still can't believe any of us survived that hell. I was especially surprised that I was still alive, for I'd never been particularly healthy. Now I would finally learn what it was like to fight at the front. I would have to face something far beyond the worst of what I had already experienced. The bunkers and hangars of the Luftwaffe's temporary airfield served as a resting place for us that we simply could not do without. The Luftwaffe troops had abandoned most of the field. They had to withdraw to the west, but some combat airplanes were still there, half dismantled, iced over. Most of the equipment was taken out by headquarters on skids driven by tractors. In these more or less comfortable conditions, we were given a few days' rest. However, as soon as we recovered a little, the authorities moved us into the thick of things. For the fighters fighting in this sector, our company was an unexpected reinforcement. We were divided into squads and assigned different tasks. 3/4 of the company was assigned to prepare positions for 77mm guns and even for small-caliber machine guns. This meant shoveling huge masses of snow and then tackling the ground, which was harder than stone, which was broken with picks and explosives. Jules Lenson and I managed to get into one squad, the one assigned to deliver supplies and weapons to an infantry unit 10 kilometers away. We were given a pair of sleds, each pulled by a trio of step ponies. The distance was short. We were much better equipped than on the last tragic expedition and thought we could get there and back in a day. There were 8 of us, including the sergeant. I was on the second sled, which carried grenades and magazines for large-caliber machine guns. Seated on the sled, I could enjoy the view of the deserted surroundings. From time to time, stunted trees emerged from the snow-white ground. They seemed to be engaged in an unequal struggle with the immense whiteness. It overcame them, slowly but surely. There was nothing else to be seen in these parts, where only wolves must have dwelt, but a pale greyish-yellow sky. We seemed to have reached the edge of the earth. After a while, we came to a path. At the edge of the dense forest, from somewhere behind the trees, a soldier appeared and stopped the first sled. After a few words with the sergeant, he stepped aside to let us pass. We drove into the forest, where we saw the machine gun in action. 2 soldiers were manning it. Soldiers' countless tents, guns, light tanks, mortars placed on skids. A slaughtered horse was hung from a tree. Soldiers in overcoats stained with blood were turning it into steak. We were asked if we had brought any mail, and burst into curses when they learned that we had no letters with us. An officer checked our papers. The company we were serving was east of here. With a guide adjutant, we continued through forests in which 3,000 or even 4,000 men were concealed, and then crossed a range of small, half-hollow hills. It was as if I could still see them before me. 3 telephone wires crossed the white snow, slightly buried. "Here we are," said the adjutant. He was on horseback. "Beyond the edge of the forest you will get under enemy fire, so do not spare the horses. Follow the wire. The company you're looking for is about 1 kilometre from here." He saluted properly and rode off. We looked at each other. "There we go again," said the sergeant, undoubtedly a veteran logistics officer. He led us forward, but stopped abruptly. "If we're going to try to break through, we'll have to really go as fast as we can. Get the horses going. If the Russians spot us, they will fire, but it usually takes some time before they start firing. If it gets very hot, we'll have to leave the sledge with ammunition. If you are less than 30 meters away from them, you'll have to forget your mother forever." I remembered about the attack on the convoy near Kharkov. "Let's go," someone shouted to show that he was not afraid of anything. The sergeant climbed onto the first sled. Soon we reached the top of the hill. The horses, panting from the ascent, stopped before they began their descent. "Chase them down," roared the sergeant. "We can't stay here." "Whip them," shouted Gales to the guy holding the reins. Our sleigh started down first, as now I see 3 horses jumping on the snow from one bump to another. The white cloud could be seen from afar. The 3 of us huddled behind the driver, in the centre of the sleigh, on dark green boxes with writing in white letters, the mere thought of which made us sick. We were so afraid that we forgot to think of the frost. Through the white blizzard that covered my eyes, I tried to see the horizon, though we were going very fast. It seemed to me that in the distance we could see huts in front of us. All around, surprisingly symmetrical trenches broke the immaculate whiteness of the slope. Despite the high speed, I noticed how unusual the borders of these pits looked. The earth torn out by the explosions had taken on a bright yellow hue. They resembled huge, bizarre flowers with dark brown middles and yellow petals that turned a pale, almost white colour at the edge. The trenches, which had long since been dug there and had already been covered with snow, were varieties of this marvellous pattern. Without incident, we descended the mountain. A few almost ruined huts and large cannons, sunk in the snow, came into view. At a hut with a roof that had come down to the ground, we stopped. The wall nearest to us was a lattice, through which we could see the sappers working inside. They seemed to be dismantling the house. Several men came out with logs in their hands. A plump sergeant appeared, carrying something white. "Unload it right here," he said. "The sappers are rebuilding the barn. They'll be done in..." From the rumble of gunfire, we threw ourselves to the ground. We saw yellow flashes on the right, and then a geyser of rock and dirt 30 feet into the air. The sergeant turned calmly toward the rupture. "No doubt," he said. The sergeant glanced at our papers. "Ah," he said, patting the boxes with his gloved hand. "It's not for us. Our shipments are 3 days late and we're living on untouchable supplies. If it continues like this, you chauffeurs don't miss the chance to have fun, soldiers at the front die of frost, and when it's empty inside, it's not much of a fight." He patted his belly. His waist didn't look like he'd been fasting long. He must have had time to build up his own personal storehouse of food. At the front, despite our efforts, there was clearly a shortage of food. "You'll go that way." The sergeant pointed to a path. "The unit holds part of the Don coast. It's better to crawl unless, of course, you value your life." We set off through the snow. The road was indicated by trucks half buried in the snow. Behind an elevation, a specially thrown snowdrift covered large-caliber guns and heavy howitzers. We passed them, and they completely disappeared from our eyes. Splendid camouflage. We came to a trench where skinny horses were digging the ground with their hooves. Bundles of hay had been thrown to them, so dry that it looked like dust. The poor creatures poked their nostrils into the hay, but they had no appetite for it. A few frozen horse corpses lay on the ground among the horses that were still standing. Soldiers in long overcoats watched the horses. As we passed through the trenches, we heard a machine gun firing somewhere nearby. Now we have arrived at the place, said our driver with a strange smile. Trenches, shelters everywhere. We were stopped by a patrol. 9th Infantry Regiment in your company. Said the lieutenant. Is that for us? No, Mr. Lieutenant. We're looking for another unit. Ah, said the officer. We'll have to leave the sled here. The unit you need is over there on the river bank, on a small island. We'll have to follow the trenches. We're in range of Russian fire, and they don't always sleep. Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant. The sergeant's voice trembled. The lieutenant called out to one of the soldiers standing nearby. Asked me, show them where to go and come back. The soldier saluted and came with us. Like the others, I took the heavy box. I had to carry it on my back. Again the machine gun line sounded, but louder now. There we go again. Is it serious or not? The firing stopped and then began again. It's ours, answered the guide. But wait, you can't tell at once whether they are just disturbing the enemy or starting an ice rush? We listened to him without uttering a word. In this tense situation, he was surprisingly calm. How could we, newcomers? A few scars received on the highway named after the 3rd International seemed a trifle in comparison with what could happen here. The firing stopped and started again, sometimes very close. And then the guns rumbled from somewhere, but Hale suggested putting the crates on top of the rifles. It was a sort of stretcher. We had just put his plan into practice when several explosions came one after another. And that's the Russians, grinned the veteran in front of us. The air shook. The explosions were blasting the ground 300 or 400 yards away from us, to our left. It was their artillery. Maybe they were attacking. Suddenly, 30 meters to the left, there was a cat-like screech of shells, then another and another. We quickly lowered our burdens and crouched in the shelter, looking around in fright. There was silence in the air for a moment. Don't be afraid, guys, said our guide, who had also taken cover. Behind that snowdrift we have a battery of 170mm guns, so we have something to answer the Russians. Again there was a strange sound. Even though the veteran explained to us what it was, I felt cold inside. Put on helmets, said the field officer. If the Russians know that there is a battery, they will shoot at it. And on the road, added the guide. For 40 kilometers around there is no quiet place. We are no safer here than anywhere else. We sped forward. The air shook for the 3rd time with bursts, and there was artillery fire all around. The German battery was firing non-stop. We passed 3 soldiers uncoiling a telephone cable on the path that crossed our route. Now we had calmed down a little. Perhaps the attack has begun, said the veteran. I'll leave you. I have to go back to the company. Where should we go? Asked the sergeant, scared to death. And follow the path to that gun over there. They'll tell you where to go. But first have something to eat. It's lunchtime. He walked back. He walked a few steps at full height, and then he bent 3 times. That's how you move on the battlefield. A few days later, I got so used to it that it seemed impossible to walk otherwise. We opened our wooks and started to eat in the snow. However, I was not too hungry. The explosions, which made my head buzz under my icy helmet, discouraged my appetite. Giles, not quite mastering himself, was rolling his eyes like a hunted animal. He looked at me, shaking his head. We shouldn't have eaten. The deafening whistle of a shell that flew directly above us interrupted our conversation. We pulled our heads into our shoulders and closed our eyes. Giles was just about to continue when another whistle sounded, and a thunderous burst shook the ground, followed by another The ground seemed to rise beneath us. A hail of rock and ice fell. We huddled together, not daring to move. The rifles and pots flew aside. "They'll kill me," shouted a young boy who had grabbed my arm in the confusion. "They're going to kill me." Another shell exploded. And then there was a deafening volley of German guns. Let's go. We can't stay here, roared the sergeant, pulling his helmet deeper over his head. Like robots, we lifted the crates. The trench was big enough for 4 of us to walk shoulder to shoulder, but we walked alone, keeping to one wall. I followed Gowles, and he was right behind the sergeant, who kept pushing us. Hurry up. The Russians have discovered our battery. They can't see it, but our trench is right in their line of fire. We have to turn to another trench as soon as possible. Almost every minute we'd throw ourselves to the ground. The heavy boxes were slipping out of our icy fingers, no matter how hard we tried to hold on to them. It's a wonder they haven't exploded yet. Hurry up, yelled the sergeant, paying no attention to anything. Over there. Say, Sergeant, said Gales. There are twice as many boxes left on the sled. Do we have to carry them here too? Yes, of course. But how should I know? Hurry up, for God's sake. While the Russians were reloading their guns, our battery fired 2 shots. The next Russian volley whistled 50 meters behind us, and the next 2 at an unknown distance, but we still slightly slowed down. Suddenly there was a deafening whistle, and then such a rumble that the ground and air shook. One edge of the trench collapsed. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to take cover. I remember only seeing a flash and a lot of splinters scattered around the trenches. We fell to the ground again. No one had the courage to get up. Hurry up, get up. We must get into another trench, shouted the sergeant, his face contorted with fear. If a grenade falls here, we'll all blow up. There were 2 more explosions. Our guns were firing relentlessly. Grabbing the crates, we climbed up the rubble over the corpse of some poor fellow who had gone up in the air. As we ran through, I caught a glimpse of him, a disgusting sight. His helmet was flying off his face, and his visor was half smashed into his chin, or maybe it was his neck. The heavy winter uniform dangled like a sack over what was no longer a man. His leg had been torn off, or maybe it was under him. Another corpse lay nearby. A Russian grenade had landed right on some poor people who had hoped to take shelter here to wait out the storm. I vividly remember the first dead men I encountered in the war. The thousands and thousands of others I saw afterward have been erased from my memory. I am still haunted by the nightmare. The horrible mutilations, the figures of some men who seem to be sleeping peacefully, or the corpses of others, with eyes wide open, in which an inexpressible horror lingers. I thought that I had suffered so much fear, experienced such a thing, that I would return home as a real military man and tell of my heroic deeds. I am telling now about what I experienced on the road from Minsk to Kharkov, and to the Don with the words that seemed to me the most appropriate. But these words should have been left for what I saw afterwards. It is true that it will be difficult to find them. For example, one cannot use the adjective terrible when describing fellow travellers torn to pieces and rubbed into the ground. But such a mistake is forgivable. Perhaps I should end the narrative there. Those who have not themselves experienced what I have had to face may sympathize with what is happening, just as we experience events together with the hero of a novel or play. But they will not be able to fully understand my feelings. After all, one can never understand what cannot be explained in words. All these reservations may not be interesting to the world to which I now belong. But I will let my memory express the thought as clearly as possible. I dedicate the rest of the story to my friends Marius and Jean-Marie Kaiser. They are the only ones who can understand Mech. They lived through essentially the same events in the same region. I will try to describe in words the deepest human madness, which I could not even imagine. I could not have imagined that such a thing was possible if I had not gone through it myself. We reached the trench that seemed to our sergeant to be a safe hiding place, and literally burrowed into it. The instant the most powerful explosion blew the soil from its edge. 2 soldiers in white camouflage coats stood in the trench. One, at the cannon, was surveying the battlefield through field binoculars. The other, at the back of the trench, was fiddling with radio equipment. "In your unit?" the sergeant asked, catching his breath. "We have supplies for them." "It's close by," said the soldier with the binoculars, "but you won't be able to get there. You'll blow up. Put your explosives, not here, and go to the bunker." He smiled. We didn't make him repeat the invitation twice and headed for the tomb-like structure of boards and earth, almost unlit. 4 soldiers were already inside. One of them had somehow managed to sleep. The others were writing by the flickering light of a candle. The height of the bunker did not allow us to straighten up. Everyone sitting in the bunker had to move so we could enter. Will it hold? Gales asked, pointing a ragged finger at the roof of the structure. Well, if a grenade falls near it, it might collapse. One of the soldiers replied with an ironic smile. And if it lands right on top of us, our comrades won't even have to bury us, added another. And how are they joking? They must be used to it. The soldier who was sleeping woke up and yawned. I thought they sent us women. No, just some kids. Sergeant, where did you get this brood? Everybody laughed. The ground shook again, as if not to let us relax too much. From here, the sounds of the explosions didn't seem so strong. They're recruits from the supply train. They've come all the way across Russia to give you something to stuff your bellies with. Big deal, said the guy who had just woken up. We've been sweating here for 3 months, and you've only had fun so far. There are beautiful girls in Ukraine, I know, but you shouldn't have stayed there so long. We're starving here. I joined the conversation in my disgusting German. Wow, girls. We haven't seen any girls. Nothing but snow. How sucks? Someone asked in French. No French. Gales joked. Everyone laughed. Gales was pushed to the back of the room. Thank you, said the one who asked the question in French, extending his hand to me. He had good pronunciation. My mother is German, I answered. Ah, that's how it is. Your mother is German. Wonderful. The ground shook once again. Something fell from the ceiling onto our helmets. It's not very nice here, said the sergeant, who still couldn't recover from his fear. He didn't care whether my mother was German or Chinese. Oh, it's the Russians who are having fun, said another. 3 days ago we gave them such a beating that they calmed down in no time. Really? Sure. The bastards made us go back behind the Don probably a month ago. We retreated 30 kilometers, if not more. Now the front line is on the west bank. They've tried to cross the river on the ice 4 times already. The last time was 5 days ago. That's when it was really bad. They attacked for 2 days, especially at night. What a mess we've been in. See, I still can't sleep now. We haven't slept much lately. We should counterattack, but we haven't gotten our act together yet. Look through the binoculars. There are still Russians on the ice. Those pigs aren't even picking up the wounded. Some of them are probably still moaning. But we have to deliver the cargo to the Enya unit, explained the sergeant. You'll find them further down, right on the riverbank. I don't envy them. They must have retaken the island. They left it when they had to fight hand to hand, but they took it back in the morning. No one's going to get hurt out there, that's for sure. Personally, I prefer to stay here. Our battery had been silent for several minutes, but the Russian grenades, though not so often, were constantly flying. A soldier with binoculars came in hunched over. He was blowing on his fingers. No, it's your turn, he said to his partner. I'm shivering so much I'm afraid my teeth will fall out. The man he was addressing stood up, muttered something, and made his way to the exit. Our guns aren't firing anymore. Have they been destroyed? Asked the sergeant to the newcomer. Well, you'll say, answered the soldier. He was still rubbing his fingers. Without them, we would have had a hard time. We had to retreat a few days ago when they were gone. I hope our comrades from the 107th Company are alive. I hope so too, agreed our sergeant, realizing that he had said something stupid. But why aren't they firing? Ammunition is already short. We have to shoot a little, only when we know that we will not miss. The infantry and artillery have to conserve ammunition and shells. But the Russians can't guess that, so every now and then we show what we can do. You hear that? I heard. They're not firing anymore, said someone from our squad. Yeah, it's quiet. Don't miss the moment, said one of the battery men. Well, guys, let's go, said our sergeant, who slightly came to his senses. In front of these veterans of the battles on the Don, we really seemed like children. A few blows of large-caliber guns we perceived as the end of the world. We did not look at all like the proud soldiers we had been in Poland, when we marched with our heads held high through the villages with rifles in our hands. How many times in the past I had thought myself invulnerable in shoulder pads, helmets, magnificent uniforms. How I loved the sound of the marching march, and still do in spite of everything. But here, on the banks of the Dnieper, we resembled miserable creatures shivering under a pile of rags. We were emaciated and covered with mud. Huge rushes swallowed us up. Travelling through it in trucks, we were not noble warriors, but some servants of the army. Like the others, we died of cold, but no one thought of our fate. We cautiously climbed out of our hiding place, peering over the embankment that screened us from the war, and took up our dangerous luggage. Everything seemed to have calmed down. No more noise was heard. The light in the sky faded. We went along the trenches, which became shelters for half-frozen soldiers, warmed by gasoline heaters. Everywhere we were asked, "Is there mail?" 3 Messerschmitts flew by. The air was filled with our cheers. The infantry's faith in the Luftwaffe was complete. The silhouettes of airplanes with black crosses more than once brought back the courage that had been lost and helped to repel the Russian attack. As we marched forward, several times we had to press against the walls of the trench so that those carrying stretchers with the wounded could pass. We were approaching the very edge of the German positions. The trenches were getting lower and narrower, so that soon we had to walk in a chain, bent 3 times so that we would not be seen. Several times I looked up. 60 yards ahead, we could see tall grass. It was the bank of the river where the unit to which we were bringing supplies was located. The trench now only half concealed us. Jumping from one funnel to another, we kicked up earth and snow with our feet. In one of the funnels, a corpsman in heavy winter uniforms was bandaging 2 soldiers who clenched their teeth to keep from screaming. He reported that we had arrived at our destination. We didn't waste time assessing the situation the damn unit was in. We simply put the crates in the designated hole and turned around to start the return trip. By nightfall, we had completed what turned out to be called priority supplies for a unit on the front line. Nothing more had happened since the bombardment of the afternoon. The unfortunate soldiers caught on the down were preparing for another icy night. Although the temperature had risen a little, it was still very cold. We were waiting for 2 of our squad, collecting letters that the soldiers had managed to scribble down. Gales, another soldier, and I were sitting on a rampart of frozen ground, hidden from the enemy. "I wonder where we'll spend the night," said Gales, looking at his boots. Probably in the open air," answered our travelling companion. "I don't see any hotels around here." "No? Come here," someone called out to us. "There is a beautiful view of the river from here." We got up from the ground and looked through the icy branches, under which there was a large-caliber machine gun ready to fire. "Look," said Gales. "There are corpses on the ice." Yes, they were motionless bodies, victims of the fighting that had taken place a few days before. The soldiers on the battery did not exaggerate. The Russians did not bury their dead. I gazed into the distance, looking for the island of which we had heard so many times. But it was not easy to see it. The darkness was thickening. I could see only snow-covered trees. Our soldiers must be and behind, in the dense fog that descended on the gloomy surroundings, the opposite bank of the river was almost invisible. There the Russians had succeeded in stopping the advance of our troops, and from there they were watching us. I found myself on the front line, which I thought of with a shudder and which I had longed to see. Nothing happened for a while. There was almost complete silence, broken only occasionally by voices. It seemed to me that on the bank where the Russians were, thin jets of smoke were rising from the fog. Then I was pushed back by the other soldiers. "If you are so interested," said one grenadier who was standing at the machine gun, "I will gladly give you my place." "I've had enough of this frost." We didn't know what to say. His place was hardly an enviable one. A lieutenant in a heavy overcoat climbed into the funnel. Before we could salute, he raised his field binoculars and stared into the distance. A few seconds later, we heard powerful explosions coming from behind. Almost immediately, there was a ripping sound on the ice, then a repeated echo, and then a shrill whistling sound that pierced the air almost beside us. Immediately, there was a response from the entire German front. The sound of gunshots merged with the bursting of shells. We were huddled in a crater right next to the ground. "They're attacking," someone said. 2 machine gunners did not fire immediately and also looked at the Don. Some of the bursts made a sharp, violent sound. Others were muffled, as if they came from under the ground. "The ice is thinner today. It is not so cold. Soon they would have to swim." We listened to what he said. "Let us send the lightest man," said the grenadier. "If the ice holds him, we'll have to blow him up." "He's the lightest," said Gales with a wry grin, pointing to a very young soldier. "What do I have to do?" asked the boy, white with fear. "Nothing yet." "Don't be shaken. I was joking," said the artilleryman. The shelling stopped as suddenly as it had started. The lieutenant looked at the surroundings through binoculars for a while longer, then climbed up and disappeared. We remained where we were, not moving or saying a word. To break the silence, which was becoming uncomfortable, the sergeant ordered us to open our kettles and refuel. We swallowed the tasteless frozen portions without much appetite. Chewing, I walked over to the machine gun position to get another look at the river. Now I understood why our guns were shelling the river. Huge ice floes, some a foot to 2 feet thick, were sticking out perpendicular to the surface. Ice hummocks had formed from the cracked ice floes, moving downstream. The Germans fired on the ice every night to keep out the Russian scouts, who, however, still, without fear of danger, made their way onto the ice floes. And they collided with each other and broke into pieces with a terrible scraping sound. New cracks appeared. In the darkness, the sound of the ice breaking into pieces was incessant. I stood there for a long time, mesmerized by the unreality of what was happening. Hundreds of lights on the east bank of the river were coming on. "Hey," I called out to the local soldiers, "something is going on." They rushed toward me and pushed me away to see for themselves. I stuck my head between their heads. "We were scared," said one. "It's nothing. They shine like that every night. It's to let them know they're warming up. It's not such a bad idea. It's just a nuisance. You can't see the river now, even the flares don't help." And I couldn't take my eyes off it. Everywhere, all along the horizon, the Russians had lit hundreds of lights, not to keep themselves warm, for they had to keep away from the fire, but to distract our observers. And indeed, looking over the eastern shore, it was impossible to concentrate on anything. The eye was always on the lights. The rest of the space was plunged into darkness. The enemy could easily change their positions without us noticing. The bright light of the flashes did not allow us to see what was going on. The darkness and the skillfully placed lights of the enemy interfered. I would have stood like that, staring at the play of light and shadow, much longer, if the sergeant had not signalled us to return to the rear. We returned without adventure. The night, in the silence of which no sounds of war could be heard, concealed our movements. Everywhere in the trenches sat soldiers. Those who managed to sleep wrapped themselves in whatever was at hand, leaving no part of their bodies exposed, even their noses. Lips and ears were covered. Only those who had adapted to such a strange way of survival realized that underneath these rags, living people were still living and gaining strength. Some were playing cards or writing letters in the flickering candlelight. Many huddled around lamp heaters. These marvelous devices, I call them marvelous for a reason, ran on gasoline as well as kerosene. You just had to adjust the valve and the air supply. A reflector behind a glass lampshade protected the fire from gusts of wind. There were rumors that the army was developing an improved model that would run on beer. Those who were awake, not on guard duty, not playing cards, not writing letters to relatives, were consuming the liquor that circulated here as freely as other supplies. Once one wounded infantryman, waiting for a train for evacuation, said to me, "At the front there is as much vodka, schnapps and liquor as there are machine guns. It's the easiest way to make a hero out of anyone. Vodka dulls the brain and adds strength. 2 days in a row I just drink and forget about the splinters in my guts." We returned to our sled without incident. "Am I dreaming?" said Gals, "or is it really warm? In this overcoat I sweat as if in a fox coat. Maybe I've got a fever, that's all I need." "Then I've got a fever too," I said. "I'm soaking wet." "It's the fright," said the fellow who had once shouted. "They're going to kill me." "You're one to talk," said Gals, grinning. "You're so frightened that you're still greener than your overcoat, and you're talking about us." On the sled there were now 6 wounded men besides us. Though the load was lighter, the sled was not as good. The low horses had a hard time. The snow was getting softer before our eyes, and soon it turned into rain, warming tea. And this after those terrible frosts. We took it as if we had got to the Côte d'Azur. It was not until 2 hours later that we reached our units. But despite the fact that I was terribly tired physically and experienced so much during the day, I could not fall asleep at once. The banks of the Don River rose before my eyes. I heard the whistling of shells and explosions, the power of which I could not imagine. My ears ached from the shots of Mausers. Now our exercises in Poland seemed like child's play. The infantry stationed on the west bank of the river had to fight not only for survival, but also against the enemy. That was the difference between us and them. If we distinguished ourselves in the delivery of weapons and food, we were promised to be transferred to the infantry, to the advancing troops. Obviously, such a promise, given by the commander in the camp near Minsk, was intended for new recruits like Gals, Lenson, Olensheim, and me. We took it as an honour and were proud to be trusted. And the frontline soldiers blamed us for retreating from the Caucasus behind Rostov. Due to the lack of resources, the troops had to leave the territories occupied with huge losses so that they would not suffer the same fate as the defenders of Stalingrad. The officers demanded from us to get supplies at any cost, to make superhuman efforts even on pain of death. We thought we had done even more, but in fact, despite the desperate strain, we had not accomplished even half of what was expected of us. Maybe we, too, would have been better off dead. Total self-sacrifice was how the commanders put it. The phrase stuck in my head as I stared wide-eyed into total darkness, gradually falling into a dream like falling into a deep black hole. For 3 or 4 days we were busy doing the same thing. The snow was melting everywhere. The frost was falling as fast as it had risen in its time. That is how the seasons change in Russians. After a severe winter, we found ourselves in the midst of a hot summer. There was no spring in between. From the thaw, our military situation not only did not improve, but even worsened. The temperature jumped from 5 degrees below zero to +40. The melted snow became a veritable ocean. Huge puddles were forming everywhere. But for the Wehrmacht, which had experienced the horrors of 5 winter months, the drop in temperature was a blessing from God. The sun peeped through more and more often. Following orders, and even without them, we took off our overcoats and began cleaning. We undressed and plunged into the icy water of the ponds formed to wash ourselves. No shooting was heard. The war itself, which we still could not forget, became less brutal. I became acquainted with a nice soldier, a field fell in the engineers, whose unit was temporarily housed in the hut next to ours. He was a native of Kiel, a town near Strasbourg, and knew France better than Germany. He spoke excellent French. Conversations with him gave me a break from the strenuous search for German words, without which I could not communicate freely with the other comrades. Often Gales participated in our conversations. He wanted to learn French, just as I Yes, they've had it, said Gales. They've lost their nerve. I wouldn't be surprised if they had laid down their arms. We and the Ivans, too, had such a thing going on. Well, let them rejoice now, he said Ernst. Something strange is happening. In that truck with a radio station continuously receive radio reports, and the couriers are coming in droves. The last one had to abandon his scooter and sleep on the mud to deliver a message to the commandant. Maybe a congratulatory telegram for your shower, said Giles. I like your idea, but I doubt it. If these guys are running, it won't be long before the rest of us are. Defeatist, Giles bellowed as we left. When we returned to camp, we saw that nothing had changed, at least outwardly. We devoured the smoky concoction served by the cook and prepared for another peaceful evening, and then Los's whistle blew, calling the gathering. Jesus, I thought to myself, Newbuck wasn't wrong. Here we go again. I'll refrain from commenting on your appearance, said Leos. Pack your bags. We can leave any minute. Is that clear? Shit, came a voice. All good things come to an end quickly. What did you think you were going to do, sit here and chill? The war ain't over. If the order was to pack up, it was necessary to prepare for the review. To tidy up uniforms, polish and buckle belts and buckles properly. This, at least, was the case in Chemnitz and Bialystok. Else plus, discipline fell, but it all depended on the disposition of the inspector. He could pick on the way the rifle was greased and the way the boots were polished, and the result was hard work or continuous guard duty. I still remember the 4 hours in the brig I received a few days after my arrival in Chemnitz. The lieutenant made a circle on the cement floor of the Platz on the place where the sun shone brightest. Here I was to stack the penalty bags filled with sand, which weighed almost 30 kilograms. I weighed only 52. After 2 hours, my helmet was hot in the sun, my knees were buckling, and I had to make desperate efforts not to fall. I almost cried a few times. That's how I learned my lesson. A real soldier doesn't walk around the barracks yard with his hands in his pockets. So we quickly took up our uniforms and, like obsessive, began to polish our muddy boots. We wouldn't walk 10 meters before everything would be covered with mud again. We had an hour to get our belongings in more or less decent condition, and there were still 24 more to go before the rural vacation on the Dome turned into a nightmare. The next day, after a hurried packing, I was put on guard duty. The time of my duty was determined from midnight to 3:30. Gathering the remnants of patience, I stood on empty ammunition crates, placed so that the sentry would not drown in the mud. Behind the elevation of the crates lurked a pit filled with water, into which the sentry in charge of gasoline could easily fall if he dozed off. It was not a very cold night. The wind carried thick white clouds across the sky, from behind which a large moon occasionally appeared. The silhouettes of trucks and tents could be seen on the right. The sky merged in vast darkness with the mountainous horizon. At a distance of 5 miles from the first line of German trenches silvered in the light of the moon dawn. Between us and the river, several thousand soldiers slept among the incredible mud. The wind carried the sounds of engines. Both belligerents were moving their rear and troops under cover of darkness. 2 sentries patrolling the borders of the camp approached. We exchanged a few words which are usually said on such occasions. One of the soldiers said something funny. I was about to reply. And then the whole horizon from north to south lit up with bright flashes. The ground shook beneath me, and thunder rumbled in the air. "Oh, my God," shouted the patrolman. "The attack must have begun." Signals came from the camp, someone giving orders amid the distant bursts. A few men ran past. The awakened artillerymen ran to the guns that stood on the edge of the abandoned airfield. Since there was no order to abandon the post, I remained where I was, wondering what instructions my comrades were receiving. To continue to deliver supplies under such shelling would be to launch a very different kind of operation from what we were used to. In the distance we could still hear the sounds of firing mixed with the rattle of our guns. In the flashes of light, the fleeing soldiers seemed like puppets in a theatre of shadows. The world was shaking the earth. Every man was becoming a grain of sand, which the Colossus would do away with in one fell swoop and not even notice. Although the danger was still far away, I was ready at the first signal to throw myself into a pit filled with water. 2 tractors came toward me with their headlights off, their wheels and tracks turning the mud into a slurry. 2 soldiers jumped out of them and plunged almost headfirst into the mud. "Give us a hand, sentry," said one of them. The incessant firing was burning the sky and the ground. We filled the tractor with gasoline. "There's always something rattling," one of the tractor drivers said to me. "Good luck," I replied. A little farther away, the soldiers of my compound were trying to control the horses, which were falling into the mud and roaring desperately. Several trucks came by to pick up gasoline cans. By dawn, when I had not been replaced, I wondered if I had anything left to guard. The bombardment continued with the same vigor as before. I was tired and refused to understand what was happening. The boys from my company came up, led by a sergeant who beckoned to me to join them. Just at that moment, one of the long-range shells exploded about 100 yards away. We were tossed about, and we ran for our lives. As we ran, I looked in vain for the broad shoulders of Gales. More and more shells fell on the camp. Everywhere was on fire. We threw ourselves on the ground and got up again, all covered in mud. "There's no point in lying around," said the sergeant. "Look at me and do as I do." Something shrieked in our ears. We followed the sergeant into the mud. The tremendous explosion cut off our breathing, and then we were covered with mud. We straightened up again and lay down again, as 3 or 4 bursts were heard nearby. Behind us the fire was flaring up. As soon as the danger passed, we rushed toward the ammunition depot. The mere sight of a mountain of tarpaulin-covered boxes made us sick. If even the smallest shell hit here, there would be nothing left alive within 100 yards. "Good God," said the sergeant. "There's no one here." Unbelievable. Despising the danger, he climbed to the top of the dynamite mountain and began to check the numbers on the boxes that told him where to point them. And we stood watching him like doomed prisoners, legs apart, heads empty, awaiting orders. 2 soldiers covered in mud came running in. The sergeant began to shout something to them. Despite the rumble of the guns, they saluted. "Are you the sentries here?" "Yes, Herr Sergeant." They answered in unison. "No. So where have you been?" "The call of nature." Said one of the sentries. "No. 2 of you went at once. Idiots. There's a lot going on here. It's no laughing matter. State your names and units." The sergeant didn't think of coming down. A pig even here thinking about discipline, standing there preparing a report, as if nothing special was going on. New explosions, sounding very close, threw us to the ground. Only one sergeant did not pay attention to them. "They're clearing our rear," he said. "Probably got their goddamn infantry out. Come on, get up here and help." Paralyzed with fear, we climbed up the volcano. The flashes that illuminated everything around us gave our figures a tragic appearance. In a few minutes we were already running at full speed, laden with heavy crates. The dawn had begun. The flashes were almost invisible. The horizon was shrouded in thick smoke. By noon our artillery began to fire as well. We were running, carrying out one order or another, although we were falling over from fatigue. I remember with Gals and Lenson, we sat on the edge of a huge crater, listening to the bursts of powerful shells. For 2 days in a row we hardly slept at all. The same dance of death continued. We carried more and more wounded to the shelters, which were half filled with water. They were placed on stretchers cut from logs. Field medics gave first aid. Soon the hospitals, where the groans of the wounded never ceased, were overcrowded. New ones had to be placed in the open air directly on the mud. Surgeons performed operations on the dying here and there. The human stumps consisted of blood and mud. On the morning of the third day, the battle became even more intense. We were falling off our feet from fatigue. The shelling continued until darkness fell and then immediately ceased. Clouds of smoke could be seen all along the front. It was not just the smell of decomposing corpses, but it was the smell that comes from death when the number of dead reaches a prohibitive value. Anyone who has been through such battles knows what I am talking about. Of 2 of the 8 huts that made up our camp, only ashes remained. The remaining ones were crowded with wounded. Los, who had a good heart, allowed everyone 2 hours' sleep. We would roll right on the ground where we stood as if suddenly put to sleep. When the time of rest passed and we were awakened, we seemed to have slept only a few minutes. Once again, we had to carry agonizing cripples or dig through burned corpses looking for number plaques. They were then sent to the families back home with the inscription, "Died a hero's death on the battlefield for the glory of Germany and for the Führer." Despite the thousands of dead and wounded, the day after the shooting stopped, the Germans celebrated the battle on the Don as their victory. The mouths of the dying were opened so that they too could enjoy it by drinking vodka. Along the entire length of the 30-kilometer front, General Zhukov and his Siberian army, which had just caused the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad, tried to break the front line on the Don south of Voronezh. But the desperate attacks of the Russians crashed against our unyielding battle ranks. Thousands of Soviet soldiers paid for this unsuccessful attempt with their lives, but it also cost us very dearly. That night, 3/4 of my company left. The trucks were overflowing with wounded, lying almost on top of each other. I was without Gals and Lenson for a while. Friendship in the war was worth a lot. Maybe it was facilitated by the common hatred that united people. In ordinary civilian life, such friendship was unthinkable. Now I found myself with a couple of soldiers with whom it might have been interesting to talk, but I could never get a word in edgewise. I left them at the first opportunity, sat down in the truck, and tried to pull myself together. Early the next morning, the pickup bell sounded. I opened my eyes. The cab of the truck was a good bid. I had finally gotten some sleep, but my muscles were stiff with fatigue, and despite my sleep, I could hardly get to my feet afterward. When I got outside, I could read the same fatigue on everyone's face. Even Lars couldn't be said to be sputtering with energy. He, like the rest of us, slept in the arms of the crates. Los announced that we were heading west. We must first be ready to assist the sappers in loading or destroying what we could not take with us. We gathered around a large kettle from which we were poured a hot drink, which we did not even try to call coffee, and then went to the sappers. The entire Wehrmacht on the west bank of the Don had received orders to retreat. We were sent to mop up all the territory left behind by the troops. The order was given to take everything that could possibly be taken away. Nothing must go to the enemy. It seems everyone was leaving. To the west marched long chains of infantrymen covered with mud. Why it was heroic to resist for 3 whole days and then retreat, we could never understand. Most of us had no idea that there had been major changes on the Eastern Front since January. After the fall of Stalingrad, as a result of a powerful Soviet offensive, they managed to reach the limits of Kharkov, cross the Donets and take the direction to Rostov, cutting off the Germans' offensive routes from the Caucasus. German troops located there had to retreat to the Sea of Azov, suffering heavy losses. The newspaper Eastern Front reported that near Kharkov, in the Kuban and even in Anapar are intense fighting. Since most soldiers had a vague idea of the geography of Russia, we had no idea what was going on. Nevertheless, one glance at a map would have been enough to realize that the western bank of the Don River represented the extreme eastern point of German positions in Russia. So, fortunately for us, the High Command gave the order to retreat even before the Russian troops, having closed the pincers from the north and south, would have cut us off from our bases located in Belgorod and Kharkov. The Don was no longer our line of defense. At the thought that we could be trapped like the defenders of Stalingrad, my veins chilled. Within 2 days, the infantrymen were leaving, either on their own or in trucks. Soon only a small tank unit of the company remained in the almost completely emptied camp. The Luftwaffe airfield was a strange sight, thousands of trucks, tanks, tractors and people swarming among the mud flows. And we found ourselves in the epicenter of this syrup. Our task was to distribute the supplies left behind. The sappers were working with us. They were preparing to blow up the ammunition we had lined the barns with, attaching the remains of 8 broken trucks to their frames. By noon we had prepared a veritable fireworks display. Wagons, sleds and huts went up in the air. They all burned. The 2 large caliber howitzers, which could not be pulled out of the mire by tractors, were also to be destroyed. We pushed the first explosive we could find into the muzzles and sealed the hole properly. The howitzers split in 2 from the explosions, and deadly shrapnel sprinkled in all directions. And we were overwhelmed with some quiet. In the evening, on the territory of the camp, we found several Soviet scouts who had appeared here to find out what was going on. The troops covering the tank unit signaled that in several directions the enemy had penetrated the former German positions. The order to retreat was hastily given. We could no longer further hold the pressure of the Russians. In the last hour before departure, we came under light artillery fire, and then we set off. I was carrying my belongings, looking for a car with my eyes, when a field officer put me behind the wheel of a trophy truck. There were wounded men in it. "Step on the gas," he shouted. It was believed that all Wehrmacht soldiers knew how to drive. During the exercises in Poland, I had learned to do so, but on other vehicles, not on the Tatra. However, it was not supposed to discuss orders. On the dashboard, all the arrows were at 0. There were several buttons, and under them something was written in an incomprehensible font. The sapper attached our truck to the tank with a cable. Any minute now, the signal to start moving would be given, and I had to start the truck at all costs. I thought about getting out and reporting that I don't know how to drive such a truck, but then I might be given a heavier assignment or even offered to go on my own. If I didn't leave, I would be captured by the Bolsheviks. The thought of that sent a chill down my spine. I clutched desperately at the steering wheel, and then a miracle happened. My eyes stopped on Ernst, looking for someone to give him a ride. I was saved. "Ernst," I shouted. "This way. I've got plenty of room." My buddy happily climbed into the... "I was going to get in the back of the tank," he said. "Thanks for leaving room." "Ernst," I asked in a conspiratorial tone. "Do you know how to start the damn car? You're just sitting there and you don't know what to do." There was no time for explanations. Looking out of his car, one of the tankers ordered to start moving. Newbark turned the keys on the panel. A rumbling sound was heard in response. I pressed the gas pedal. There were several exhausts. "Watch out," the tanker shouted to me. I smiled, nodded, and released the pedal. We were off. At what speed? How was I to know? The main thing, do not backpedal. The truck swayed and went on its way. There were curses behind. After the war, in France, a self-important asshole taught me how to drive a Renault 4CV as if he were commanding an ocean liner. For the sake of a piece of pink paper that gave me the right to drive a car, I'd had to go through the stupidest exercises. I didn't even try to explain to him that I had travelled through Russia in a truck, not even on a road, but on a river, and the truck was in 2 of a tank that was swerving so much that it was about to tear down the front of my car. There was no way he would have believed me. After all, my mentor belonged to the victorious Allied forces. They were all heroes, like the French soldiers I met after the war. Only the victors have the right to tell stories. The defeated, by then bastards and fools, had to keep silent about their memories, fears and joys. The situation on the first night of the retreat was complicated by the downpour, which required Ernst and me to perform acrobatic tricks. After all, At times we had to follow at our own pace on the road paved by the tank. Without him, we would never have gotten out of this quagmire. Tankist irritably pressed on the gas pedal, occasionally dragging behind him Tatra, which seemed ready to break in two. The tank's tracks turned the ground into syrup, and the rain made soup out of it. The windshield was covered with mud, and Ernst had to get out and run forward to wipe it off with his hands. Only a small part of the headlights remained clear of mud, but soon they were completely covered with mud, and not even the tank could be seen, although it was moving no more than 5 meters away from us. On the road, our tank truck was pulled several times, and each time this happened, I wondered if the front wheels had fallen off. And in the back of the truck, the wounded were no longer moaning. Perhaps they were all dead. What did it matter now? The convoy moved inexorably forward. The rays of the rising sun illuminated the weary faces of the soldiers. There was no order. Whether we were behind schedule or ahead, it didn't matter. Suddenly, the driver of the tank turned right from the road, which even on a tank it was now impossible to pass, and drove along the roadside, tucking bushes under him. Our truck, whose wheels were no longer visible from under the mud that covered them, was dragged forward with a helplessly rumbling engine. Then everything stopped. It was the second stop since we had set out. We had stopped once before at night for refueling. The soldiers jumped out of the tank right onto the broken branch. Their backs were burning from the hot engine, and the rest of their bodies were freezing in the cold rain. There was a scuffle between a field bell from the sapper troops and the tank commander. An exchange of pleasantries almost led to a fight. The others took advantage of the respite to refuel. 1 hour break, shouted Fieldbell, who took command of the squad. Make the most of it. Fuck you. Shouted the tanker, who did not want to listen to the orders of the new commander. We'll leave when I get a good night's sleep. By morning we must be in Belgorod. Said the field officer with a steely voice. He clearly had a dream of becoming an officer. Then, putting his hand on the pistol hanging at his side, he added, We leave on my orders. I have a higher rank, so you'll have to obey. Shoot me if you want, and drive the tank yourself. I haven't slept for 2 days, and now there's no way I'll move. Silfbell blushed, but kept silent. Then he turned to the Cheeks. You two, instead of sleeping on the move, help the wounded. They have needs too. Exactly. Said the tanker, clearly looking for trouble. And when they're done, Herr Feldfebel will wipe their asses. Look at me. I'll file a report. Said the field flabel, breathing heavily. He even turned white with anger. Despite the shaking, the wounded lying in the back of the truck were still alive. They did not make a sound, and bandages soaked with fresh blood. Fighting fatigue, we helped all but one of them, who was missing both legs, to get comfortable. They were all thirsty, and we, not knowing how dangerous it was, gave them as much water and liquor as they asked for. This, of course, could not be done. We buried them in the mud, marking the graves with sticks with helmets on them. Then we settled down with Ernst in the truck, intending to get some sleep, but sleep did not come, and we just lay there and talked about peace. 2 hours later, the tank commander gave the order to leave. Just as he had said, half the morning passed. It was a clear day. Large flakes of snow were slowly falling from the trees. Said the tank man. The general escaped while we were asleep. Probably wanted to go. And indeed, Fieldfell disappeared. Maybe he got a ride in one of the trucks that passed by while we were resting. Well, that bastard will make a report, shouted the tanker. Well, if I find him, I'll beat the spirit out of him like a damned Bolshevik. It took us some time to get out of the bushes into which we had driven. But in 2 hours we had already entered a village, the name of which had been erased from my memory. It was situated 30 kilometers from Belgorod. Everywhere swarmed soldiers of various branches of the army. The streets in the village were perfectly straight. The houses were low, and the roofs resembled heads without foreheads. The hair immediately grew into eyebrows. Wagons with equipment covered in mud were moving. Soldiers were running, looking for their regiments. The road became smoother. We unhitched from the tank and took 10 sappers riding on it. Eventually I stopped the truck and looked for my company. 2 military men told me that it had left in the direction of Kharkov, but they were not completely sure and recommended that I go to the redirection center set up in the trailer. There were 3 officers in it. When I finally managed to get their attention, I got slapped for falling behind. They would have sent me to the tribunal if there had been time. Complete confusion reigned. The infantrymen were occupying the Russian huts with shouts and laughter. It was better to sleep while things settled down. They needed a dry corner to lie down in, but every hut was so full that there was almost no room left for the Russians who lived in them. I did not know what to do, so I looked for Ernst, who had gone to the field hospital, and returned to the Tatra with a medic who had examined the wounded. "They will still hold out," said the doctor. "What?" asked Ernst. But we've already buried 2. You could at least bandage them." "Don't be silly. If I write that they urgently need help, they will lie in the street waiting for their turn. You will get to Belgorod sooner, and you will not fall into the trap which is clearly planned here." "The situation is difficult?" Ernst asked. "Yes, it is. Thus and I found ourselves responsible for the fate of 20 wounded, some of whom were in the most serious condition. They had been waiting several days for first aid. We did not know what to say to the soldier who, writhing in pain, asked if we would be arriving at the hospital soon. "Let's go," Ernst said, frowning. Maybe he was right. I'd only been driving for a few minutes when Ernst tapped me on the shoulder. "No, come on, kids, stop. If you keep this up, you're going to kill somebody. I'll drive myself." "But I'm supposed to drive, Ernst. I'm in the driver's unit." "It doesn't matter. You're not going to get us out of here." That was the truth. Even though I tried my best, the truck was darting from one side of the road to the other. There were thousands of soldiers on both sides of the road. We reached the village exit, where there was a long line of trucks waiting to refuel. As we drove forward, ignoring the queue, we began to refuel. A gendarme approached us. "Why don't you wait like the others?" "We must leave immediately, Mr. Gendarme. We have wounded men." "Wounded? How badly?" Like any policeman, he spoke in a tone of incredulity. "Of course." The cop stuck his head under the tar. "I don't think they're that." Cussing broke out. The wounded took advantage of their position to insult the gendarme. "You son of a bitch," roared one who'd had part of his shoulder torn off. "That's the kind of scum we should send to the front. Let us through, or I'll strangle you with my healthy arm." Overcome with pain, the infantryman stood up, making the blood drain from his face. He seemed quite able to carry out the threat. The gendarme blushed. His nerves could not bear the sight of 20 cripples. The position of a policeman in a large city who reprimands a bourgeois for running a red light is quite incomparable to that of a military gendarme who deals with veterans with their hands on their guts. And they themselves may have beaten the guts out of the enemy. A smile appeared on the gendarme's face. "Get out of here," he said with the tone of a man who didn't care about anything. When the truck moved, he added, "Go on, you'll die somewhere else." It was difficult to get even 30 liters of gasoline, and when we poured the fuel, our huge car immediately swallowed it. But we were glad of it, just to get the hell out of here. The road was trying to get back to normal, but there were still patches of uncovered ground that turned into horrible potholes that had to be avoided at all costs. We drove both on the highway and on the side of the road, depending on the circumstances. On our right was what appeared to be a unit that was still unfired. The soldiers were wearing new uniforms. We were stopped by another squad of gendarmes who checked our documents. They inspected the truck, checked our IDs and our destination. It was the gendarmes themselves who had to tell us the latter. One of them looked in the directory hanging around his neck and barked, "Go to Kharkov." We carried out this instruction with great displeasure. The new road was a swamp. We had little gasoline left. On the way we kept coming across cars abandoned in the mud. They either broke down or ran out of fuel. We had not yet had time to pass a couple of kilometers as we were stopped by a detachment of infantrymen, 50 people. They stormed the truck. Among them there were several wounded men who had taken off their dirty rags and were walking with open wounds. "Come on, squeeze in, boys," they said. "You see, we have no room," shouted Ernst. But we couldn't get rid of them. They got into the back of the truck and started crowding the wounded. Ernst and I tried to stop them, but to no avail. The soldiers were climbing everywhere. "Take me," one of them shouted, scratching at the door with bloody hands. Another waved an expired pass. Order was restored by the arrival of a passenger car, followed by 2 trucks. An SS captain stepped out of it. "What kind of an anthill is this? It won't take long to break a truck." The strangers, leaving the wounded, immediately scattered. Ernst saluted and explained the situation. "Excellent," said the captain. You take with you, along with your wounded, 5 more. We'll take 5 more, and the rest will have to go until the medics arrive. Let's do it. Ernst explained that we were running out of fuel. The captain signalled to the soldiers, who released 20 litres of gasoline to us. A few minutes later, we were on the road again. As we passed a group of soldiers trudging through the mud, we did not stop despite requests for a ride. By noon, on the last drops of gasoline, we reached the town where the front line was assembling. Just a little more, and I would have become an infantryman prematurely. We had to wait until the next day before we could use the 20 litres of fuel that Ernst had whipped out. Volleys of large-caliber guns were heard in the distance. We thought we had moved far from the front, and now we were perplexed. At that time, we did not know. I learned about it many years later, that our route ran parallel to the Belgorod-Kharkov line. Nevertheless, having unloaded 2 dead men to make room for 3 more wounded, we left immediately. But in the afternoon, everything went wrong again. Our truck was travelling in a column of 10 vehicles. We passed a tank formation that looked like a giant replica of the creatures trudging through the mud. They were obviously heading toward the enemy. Ernst and I exchanged worried glances. Some soldiers who were setting up an anti-tank gun stopped us. Push on, guys," the officer shouted as we slowed down. "Ivan is already close." This time at least something was explained to us. But I could not understand how the Russians, who were 70 kilometers behind us, could get here so quickly. Ernst, who was driving, stepped on the gas. The drivers of the other trucks did the same. Suddenly 5 airplanes appeared in the sky at medium altitude. I pointed them out to Ernst. "They are Yeks," he shouted. "Take cover." We were surrounded by mud. Occasionally appeared shrubbery. From the sky came machine gun bursts. The column sped up, heading for a hillside that could protect us. I leaned out the window to see what was happening. 2 Focke-Wulfs appeared in the sky and shot down the Yakovs. Until the very end of the war. The Russian Air Force could not stand up to the Luftwaffe. Even in Prussia, where the most active Russian aviation, Messerschmitt 109 or Focke-Wulfs, turned a dozen armoured Isle in flight. In the middle of the war, when the Luftwaffe had plenty of reserves, even a large number of Russian planes did not pose a serious threat. 2 of the 3 remaining Yoks turned to flee. They were pursued by our planes, but one enemy plane still broke through to the convoy. A Focke-Wulf chased him. We reached a hillside. The Soviet planes went down. The trucks ahead of us stopped abruptly. Those who were able to move jumped straight into the mud. I had already opened the door and climbed out when I heard machine gun shots. As I threw myself into the mud, covering my head with my hands and closing my eyes, I heard the roar of engines. Then came a loud explosion. I looked up and saw a plane with black crosses gaining altitude. 300 or 400 meters away from me fell a downed Yak, which was hidden behind a cloud of smoke. Everyone who was riding in the trucks got up. "Well, another scumbag is finished," said loudly a fat corporal who was glad to be alive. Several voices cheered the Luftwaffe. "Was anyone hurt?" "No," shouted one of the field fills. "Then let's go." I approached the Tatra, shaking off the dirt stuck to my uniform. There were 2 holes in the door, which I had opened on the way out and which now closed on its own. The paint had peeled off all around. Terrified, I opened the door, and inside I saw a man I'll never forget. He was sitting in the driver's seat as usual, only the lower part of his face had turned into a bloody mask. "Ernst," my voice trembled. "Ernst," I rushed toward him. "Ernst?" "What?" "Say something." I tried desperately to make out his features. "Ernst," I almost cried. The convoy was getting ready to leave. 2 trucks behind me honked for me to move. I ran to the first truck. "Hold it. Come with me. I got a man down." I was desperate. The truck door slid open, revealing the heads of 2 soldiers. "Come on, boy. Are you coming or not?" "Stop." I shouted even louder. "I've got a wounded man." "We have 30 wounded," the soldier shouted to me. Come on. The hospital is close." The sound of the engines of passing trucks drowned out my desperate cries. I was left alone with a Russian truck full of wounded men, including Ernst Neubachsch, dead or dying. "Miss, wait. Don't go without us." I burst into tears and obeyed the mad impulse. I grabbed the rifle I'd left in the truck. My eyes blurred, I could hardly see anything. I pulled the trigger and pointed the muzzle at the sky and fired all 5 rounds, hoping that at least someone in the trucks would take it as a call for help. But no one stopped. Trucks drove around me, slinging mud at me from all sides. Desperate, I went back to the cab and opened the first aid kit. "Ernst," I said, "I'll bandage you up." I didn't realize what I was doing. There was blood running down Ernst's overcoat. Grabbing the bandages, I looked at my friend. The bullets had hit his lower jaw. Teeth were mixed with shards of bone. I could see the facial muscles contracting. In a state close to shock, I tried to put a bandage over the wound. This I was unable to do. Then I inserted a needle into the morphine tube and tried to puncture the thick tissue, but without success. Sobbing like a child, I moved my friend to the other end of the seat. His eyes in his mangled face looked up at me. "Ernest," I shouted through my tears. "Ernst." He slowly raised his hand and placed it on my elbow. Terrified, I started the engine and tried to drive without shaking. For a quarter of an hour I drove the truck with one eye on my friend. He squeezed my arm tighter or loosened his grip. His screams sometimes overlapped the noise of the engine. I prayed, not choosing my words, saying the first thing that came to mind. "No lithium, save him, God. Save Ernst. He believes in you. Save him." But there was no miracle. In the cab of a grey Russian truck, somewhere in the vast fields of Russia, there was a desperate struggle between a man and a teenager. The man was fighting death and the teenager was fighting despair. And God, the all-seeing Lord, did nothing. The dying man was breathing heavily, bubbles of blood and saliva forming on the wound with each breath. I considered all the possibilities. I could turn around and go looking for help, or force, if necessary at gunpoint, someone to watch Ernst, or even kill him to end his suffering. But I realized all too well that I could not do that. My tears dried, leaving traces on my dirt-covered face. My inflamed eyes stared at the radiator, whose line incomprehensibly crossed the vast horizon. Every time Ernst squeezed my hand, panic gripped me. I couldn't bring myself to look at his bloody face. From above came the sound of German airplanes flying across the cloud-covered sky. Every cell in my body, trying to communicate thoughts from a distance, was asking for their help. But maybe they were Russian airplanes too. It didn't matter. I didn't have time. There was no time to loose. These words only now, as often happens in war, showed their true meaning. Ernst convulsed and grabbed my hand. He held it so long that I took my foot off the gas pedal and stopped, fearing the worst. I turned and looked at the mangled face, the eyes on which seemed to look where the living no longer look. They twitched with a strange film. My heart raced so fast that I experienced real pain. I refused to believe what was already clear. "Ernest," I shouted. From behind the truck, other shouts were heard. I lowered my comrade to the seat, begging the heavens to revive him. But Ernest's body had already slumped heavily against the other side of the cab. There it was. Death. "He's dead, Mother. Help!" Terrified, I leaned against the door of the truck and, trembling, went down to the floor. I tried to convince myself that what was happening was just a nightmare. Sitting there thinking, I didn't want to realize the horror of what had happened. I wondered how life would go on once I shook off the nightmare in which my friend had died. But my eyes saw only mud stuck to my boots. 2 heads appeared in the window of the truck cab. They were yelling something, but I couldn't hear anything. I stood up, got out of the truck, and took a few steps. The small physical effort gave me hope and vitality again. I tried to convince myself that it was all a fantasy, a bad dream to be forgotten. I tried to put a smile on my face. The 2 wounded men followed me out of the truck for a walk. I stared at them, not noticing anything. Hope overcame the gloomy thoughts. I thought that surely all the German soldiers stationed in Russia would be sent to our aid, and she is coming to us. I suddenly thought of the French. They are on their way. All the newspapers were talking about it. I've seen the pictures myself. I was cheered up. Ernst's death would be avenged. The death of a poor man who had never hurt a fly, who had done nothing but make life easier for soldiers shivering with cold. And his soul? The French will arrive, and I will be the first to run to meet them. Ernst loved them as much as he loved the Germans. I didn't know a lot of things then. I didn't know, for example, that the French had decided not to fight on our side. "What's the matter?" asked one of the wounded with a grey patch over his eyes. "Out of gas?" "No. A comrade of mine just died." They looked in the cab. "Shit. Well, it's not that bad." At least he didn't have to suffer. I knew he didn't. Ernst's death throes lasted half an hour. "We should bury him," said one of the wounded men. The three of us pulled the corpse out. He was already starting to stiffen. I moved like an automaton, my face expressionless. I saw a small hill, the ground of which was less trampled than around it. There we carried Ernst. We had no shovels. We dug with helmets, rifle butts, and just our hands. I collected documents and tokens from which we could identify Ernst. Two companions covered the body with earth and tamped it down with their boots. As I took one last look at the mutilated face, I felt something forever frozen in my soul. Nothing more horrible could have happened. We stuck a stick into the grave mound and hung Ernst's helmet on it. With a bayonet I split the stick and attached to it a leaf from the notebook Ernst always carried with him. On it I wrote in French, "On this spot I buried a friend, Ernst Newbach." Then, to keep from snapping again, I turned and ran to the truck. We set off on the road. One of the wounded men moved forward and took Ernst's place. Some fool who almost immediately fell into slumber. 10 minutes later the engine sneezed and stalled. The impact woke up my sleeping travelling companion. Something wrong with the engine? No, I said without thinking. We're out of gas. Shit, what do we do now? We walk. It's nice to walk on a sunny day like this. The stronger ones will have to help the others. My friend's death made me a cynic. I was almost glad that the others would have to suffer like me. My travelling companion looked me over from top to bottom. What do you mean by that? We can't go. His stupid certainty drove me mad. An asshole who never thinks about anything. He went to war because he was sent. Then a Russian grenade exploded too close and wounded him. That was all he knew and all he felt. He's been drugging himself with sulfonamide ever since. You can stay here and wait for help to come or for Ivan to come. I'm leaving. I went to the back of the truck, opened the side and explained the situation. There was a disgusting odour inside. The wounded were lying intermingled. Some didn't even hear my words. I was ashamed of my cruelty, but what else was there to do? 7 or 8 wounded men struggled to rise. Their facial features protruded sharply. Stubble protruded from their cheeks and their eyes glittered feverishly. I had already repented. Should I have made them walk? When those who could walk got out of the car, we discussed the fate of the others. Hey, they can't be lifted. Come on, let's not tell them anything. Maybe someone will drive by and help them. There are more trucks following us. Our unfortunate party set off. We were haunted by the ghosts of the dying men left in the Tatra. But what else was there to do? I was the only one who was uninjured and carrying a gun. I offered them Newbach's pistol, but no one was willing to take it. Soon an automobile approached us. It stopped, though we did not signal. In it rode 2 soldiers from the armoured forces, 2 noble men. One gave way to the wounded man, collected his belongings, got out and came with us. Somehow we managed to squeeze 3 more wounded into the car. So, again, a strong and young man kept me company. His noble gesture aroused warm feelings in me. I no longer remember his name. I only remember that we talked about many things. He told me that the Russians had launched an offensive quite suddenly, and that in this vast territory we could be stopped at any moment by their tank units. My mouth was dry, but my travelling companion had no doubts about his forces or the capabilities of our army. It's spring, so we will resume the offensive. We'll push the Ivans back over the Don and over the Volga. It's amazing how someone who feels utterly defeated needs reassurance and encouragement. It seemed as if heaven itself had sent me this soldier to lift my spirits. Of course I would have been happier if Newbach had survived, but in the face of Providence there was no point in protesting. It was I, not Newbach, who was to be the one to drive and die. And toward evening we came to a lonely farmhouse. We approached with all caution. Partisans liked to hide in such places. They had the same choice as we did, and a roof over their heads is a roof for everyone. The tall soldier who had come with me went forward, slowly and cautiously, keeping his hands on his gun. For a while he disappeared behind the buildings. A chill ran down our backs, but soon he looked out again and called us with a gesture. There were Russians living in the farm who did their best to relieve the suffering of the wounded. A woman cooked us a hot lunch. The peasants said they hated the communists. They'd have been expelled from their own small farm near Vitebsky to work on the large collective farm we were passing through. They said they often gave shelter to German soldiers. In one barn they have a Volkswagen that broke down and was left behind by some German battalion. They are not bothered by the partisans, although they know that they often shelter where marked soldiers. Talking about the Volkswagen did not please our tall travelling companion very much. Maybe they lied about everything and just stole it. We tried to start the car, but although the engine started, it wouldn't move. "We'll fix it tomorrow," said the soldier. "Now we should get some rest. I'll be on duty first and you'll take over at midnight." "Shall we keep watch?" I asked in surprise. "We'll have to. These people can't be trusted. All Russians are liars. So we won't be able to sleep well tonight." I went to the back of the barn, which was in semi-darkness. From bales of hay and straw I prepared a soft bed. I was about to take off my boots when my comrade stopped me. "Better not. You won't be able to wear them tomorrow. Let them dry right on your feet." I was about to reply that the wet leather of the boots would not let my feet dry, but I said nothing. What, after all, did it matter if my boots or my feet got wet? I felt wrung out, dirty, and utterly wrecked. "But it's worth washing your feet. It will cheer you up. But tomorrow? What kind of a man is this?" He was just as muddy as I was, but he seemed to be bursting with energy, as if nothing had happened to change his routine. "Tired as hell," I said. He laughed. I threw myself onto my back, fighting the exhaustion that made my back and neck muscles ache. I stared into the darkness. All I could see through the darkness were the dirty slabs of the barn. The sleep was bad, dreamless. Only happy people have nightmares, from overeating. For those who live in a nightmare, sleep is like a black hole with no time, like death. The sound of someone moving next to me woke me up. I sat up slowly. It was dawn, and I could see the clear sky through the wide door of the barn. At the door, immersed in sleep, sat my comrade of yesterday. What, he was already dead? I was convinced that life and death are so intertwined that one can easily pass from one state to another without anyone noticing. In the fresh morning air, I could hear the sounds of bursts. I went over to my older comrade and shook him properly. He mumbled something. "Get up." He immediately stood up and reached for his weapon. I even got scared. "Yes? What's wrong?" he asked me. "Shit, it's dawn. I fell asleep on duty, damn." He was so angry I couldn't laugh. But his oversight allowed us both to sleep. Suddenly he pointed his rifle at the open door. Before I could turn around, I heard someone else's voice. One of the Russians who had sheltered us yesterday came in and stood in the doorway. Comrade," he said in German. "This morning is not good. Bang Bang is already near." We came out of the barn. On the roof of a small building in front of us stood some Russians and looked around. We heard more explosions. "The Bolsheviks are already near," repeated the Ukrainian, turning to us. "We are leaving with the German soldiers." "And where are the wounded?" asked my comrade, annoyed that he had been taken by surprise. "Where they were put yesterday," answered Ivan. "2 Germans died." We, not understanding anything, looked at him. "Come help us," said my travelling companion. 2 of those who were seriously wounded died. There were 4 left who were also badly wounded. One of them was moaning and holding onto his right arm, which was missing a hand. Gangrene was beginning to set in and was consuming his last strength. "Dig 2 graves over there," ordered the tall soldier. "We must bury them." "We are not soldiers," Ivan replied with a smile. "You dig a grave. 2 graves." The German insisted, aiming his rifle at the Russians. 2 graves and hurry up." The eyes of the Russian, staring at the muzzle of the gun, glistened. He said something in Russian. The others got down to business. We began to change the wounded bandages, and then we heard the sound of an engine in the yard. Without even thinking, we ran outside. Several armoured personnel carriers approached. German soldiers jumped out of them and ran to the well. Behind the vehicles followed 4 tanks Mark IV. An officer came out. We hurried to meet him and explained who we were. "Okay," said the officer. "Help us unload. You're coming with us?" We tried to move the Volkswagen, but we couldn't do it. So they pulled it out of the barn and threw a grenade. In a second the car was blown to pieces. More cars appeared. We couldn't understand what was happening. In the southeast, the explosions continued unabated. The highway that passed through the collective farm was now jammed. When trucks stopped, I asked if the soldiers knew about my company, but no one had any idea. My comrades in the 19th Company seemed to have travelled far to the west. Now I turned west again, finding myself in a car in the company of soldiers assembled from several infantry units. We were apparently driving parallel to the front line, perpendicular to the positions of the Russians, who had launched an offensive from the north in a southerly direction, hoping to encircle our troops, who were still in the Voronezh-Kursk-Kharkov triangle. For a day and a half we travelled in vehicles that had been used in Russia since the German offensive of 1941. Our troops had to abandon a large number of trucks, tractors and tanks. The tanks had a particularly hard time. They found themselves in conditions that their designers could never have imagined. It was not uncommon to see one tank dragging 5 trucks behind it. But when the Russians went on the counter-offensive, it became clear that our light tanks could not compete with the famous T-34, far superior to the Mark II and Mark III. Later we had Tigers and Panthers in service, capable of opposing the T-34 and, unfortunately, on the ground as well as in air battles, we had to fight with superior enemy forces and moreover on 2 fronts. In fact, we were defending a fortress with a perimeter of 15,000 kilometers. Here is just one example. During the fighting on the Vistula, north of Krakow, 28,000 German army, supported by 36 tanks Tiger and 20 Panther, was powerless against 2 powerful Soviet armies, consisting of 600,000 soldiers and 7 regiments, which had at their disposal 1,100 tanks of various names. By noon the next day we arrived at a village about 15 miles northeast of Kharkov. It was called Ukraini, or something like that. I don't remember exactly. Villages were burning everywhere, and judging from the sounds, there was still fighting going on nearby.